This is Jack Stanley, and this is number 4 in my little talk on the American presidency. Obviously, I'm not talking about all aspects of the presidency, just touching on bits and pieces, just thoughts that come to mind. Now, I ended last with James Monroe in the presidency, and he was the last of the colonial. He was the last veteran of the American Revolution. Although the fellow who would replace him as the 6th president was in many respects as much a veteran of the war as Monroe, outside of the fact that he was a boy. He was very immersed in the actions of what was going on during the American Revolution diplomatically. We're talking about John Quincy Adams. Now, if I had to make a listing or make a poll of the greatest intellect of the American presidency, I would probably have to say, without possibly maybe 2 exceptions, John Quincy Adams. I think that he takes the top tier. There may be a few who may argue that fact, but there are a few people who could arguably even come close to the intellectual prowess that was John Quincy Adams. At the age of 10, he's his father's secretary as he's going into Europe during the American Revolution. He's in an American ship that is attacked by the British. He meets Voltaire. He is in Paris. He's with Franklin. He's with Jefferson. He is surrounded and working with his father as they're dealing with issues dealing with the American Revolution. That's why I call him a bit of a veteran. No, he did not fight any battles, but he was in the thick of everything in the American Revolution. He was even making musket balls as a little boy for the troops in 1775. He watched the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was actually called Breed's Hill, but that's another story altogether. So John Quincy Adams was a diplomat. He was exceedingly experienced. He was a congressman, senator, an educator, an author, a lecturer, a scientist, a politician, a diplomat. He was everything. He spoke 8 languages. He wrote in 8 languages. I remember walking through his library, and in Quincy, Massachusetts, which is the way it's pronounced. Lots of people call him John Quincy Adams. It's Quincy. That is the way it's pronounced. His library in Quincy, Massachusetts, incredible. I always remember, after he left the presidency, of course, he did amazing things as well. Of course, he became a lowly congressman for 17 years after the presidency. He represented the Amistad slaves. He won them their freedom. I remember at his library on a desk was a very, very large Bible. And on the front of the Bible, on the front pages, were a series of X's. Those were the signatures of the Amistad slaves saying thank you. Because he was just rabid against slavery. Now, I want to tell you something that's very interesting here about the American presidency that we don't talk about much. And that is, many of our presidents were surrounded with slaves. Some only had a few, some of them had massive plantations. But let's take a look at the first 12. George Washington, well, he had a lot of slaves. John Adams, none. Thomas Jefferson had an amazing amount of slaves. He also impregnated one and had 6 children with one of them. James Madison had a massive amount of slaves. James Monroe had a large amount of slaves. John Quincy Adams had none. Andrew Jackson had slaves. Martin Van Buren had a few slaves. William Henry Harrison had some slaves. John Tyler had slaves. James K. Polk had a massive amount of slaves and bought and sold slaves while president. And Zachary Taylor, the 12th president, also had slaves. Just doing the first 12, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. So John Quincy Adams was a pretty lousy president. And the reasons that he was a lousy president has to do with Andrew Jackson. It has to do with a number of things. And the factors that lead into the election of 1824 are amongst the ugliest in the history of the American political system. First off, John Quincy Adams ran for president, and his opponent was Andrew Jackson. Remember him of the War of 1812. That's why he was famous. And Andrew Jackson was a hero to those west of the Mississippi. He was a Indian fighter, as they called him. He was a brute. Not a really nice guy. John Quincy Adams, who was a big supporter of Jackson, would suddenly get the wrath of Jackson, because Jackson was wanting to be president, and nobody told Andrew Jackson no. Well, it got ugly. The 1824 campaign was the first in which they allowed popular vote, so it really kind of changed things a lot. Andrew Jackson received more popular votes than Adams. But on the Electoral College, there was no clear winner. So it went to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay dropped his candidacy and threw his votes toward Adams. Adams also made Henry Clay his Secretary of State, which in those days was looked upon as a stepping stone to the presidency. They called it a corrupt bargain. Who knows what went on behind the scenes. It's very interesting. John Quincy Adams kept a diary throughout his life, but he didn't write at this period of time. Wonder why. It was probably a really nasty period of time for him. Well, nonetheless, the corrupt bargain took place, and Adams was made president. Jackson swore his revenge. And the Jackson campaign created so many ugly stories about Adams. And I will say that a lot of stories were made up about Jackson by those running the Adams campaign. Back and forth, it was an ugly thing. But those that were in power, there were more people in power who favored Jackson. Therefore, they promised that John Quincy Adams would never, ever get a shot of doing anything great in the presidency. And he didn't. It was an ugly, awful period of time. So, the end result was this. John Quincy Adams served in his presidency. It was a disaster. 1828 was a very ugly election. It made 1824 look like a tea party. So many ugly things were said, most of them untrue, mainly from the Jackson camp. And eventually, Andrew Jackson would become president. John Quincy Adams was shattered. His son had just committed suicide. And he just wanted to go. It was an ugly period of time. And John Quincy went back to Quincy, figuring he was going to die, but then suddenly he became a congressman. He was convinced to run for Congress. And he would serve for 17 years and die at his post. He did so much when he wasn't president because he didn't have to have the problems that he did have. He was the voice against slavery. He basically cleared the path for Lincoln. We very rarely give the credit to John Quincy that he deserves. But without John Quincy, it's questionable whether Lincoln could have done much of what he did. Because Adams destroyed the gag rule. He freed the Amistad slaves. He created the Smithsonian Institution. He pushed for education, universities, networks, highways, canals, education, and the like. We've had few people in the world who push for education, work so hard for education, and tried to share education with so many people than John Quincy Adams. Another one of our great presidents who was really lousy. But John Quincy Adams was one of the greatest Americans ever. He did more than many people will ever know. And I know when I went to his tomb, I basically said it was humbling to be there in the presence of one of the greatest people who ever represented this country.